Hey everyone, I'm Rosemary Coates in Silicon Valley. I'm your host for this edition of the Frictionless Supply Chain Podcast. I'm the executive director of the Reshoring Institute, where we help companies bring back or expand their manufacturing in the US. And I'm a contributing writer to Supply Chain Management Review. Today, I'm really excited to welcome my guest, Kari Kammel, the director, and she was just announced the director today. So the director of the Anti-Counterfeiting and Product Protection Center at Michigan State University. She's an accomplished intellectual property attorney and professor and a human rights advocate. We're going to be talking about the world of counterfeiting today and how it affects your supply chain. And this is a topic that I've been interested in for quite some time in both supply chain as well as in my expert witness work. And I truly believe that we must raise the awareness of counterfeiting to supply chain professionals because it's not high in terms of visibility, and yet it is super important. It's estimated that counterfeits represent about $30 billion per year in losses to companies. And that's just for counterfeits that are reported. And we're not just talking about fake watches and purses and stuff like that here. Counterfeits are found everywhere, including industrial goods and electronics. So let's get started. Welcome, Kari.
Thank you so much.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your background, how you came to be affiliated with Michigan State and the A-CAPP Center?
Sure. Great question. So I went to law school and had a focus in international law and wanted to spend my career doing public international law, relations between states, a lot of international criminal work and human rights work. And I did that for a few years. When I was in law school, I had studied intellectual property as well as criminal law and a whole wide range of areas as most law students do. And then, I heard about an opening at Michigan State. I had just recently come back from Iraq and had started a job at Michigan State working on Middle East programs, which was my primary international focus in the years that I spent doing international law. So I did that for a while, and then I heard about this opening at the A-CAPP Center, the Center for Anti-Counterfeiting and Product Protection, and I thought, I don't remember learning about this in law school. I studied trademark law, I studied criminal law, and I'd never heard about, IP crime, let alone trademark counterfeiting. So, I applied for the job, very curious, interested both in, the substance of the job, but what the center was doing. And ever since then, I've spent over 7 years now at the center, learning and researching and networking and discussing, with the public and private sectors what this phenomenon is, what ways we can arrest it or even prevent it, and then what we can do on the academic side to help further that goal.
So how big a problem is counterfeiting? And, I mentioned it's $30 billion, but tell us a little bit more about the details. Where are counterfeits found, and how big a problem is it?
Sure. So that is the million or billion dollar question. How big is it? And it's something that we in academia have been looking at, but it's something that's also very hard to quantify. So prior to coming into the A-CAPP Center, I had done a lot of research on human trafficking, for example. So this is another type of what we call illicit trade. Human trafficking, product counterfeiting or trademark counterfeiting, weapons trafficking, drug trafficking, they all sort of fall under this umbrella of illicit trade. And any illicit trade by its nature is very hard to measure and quantify. A lot of businesses see this as a business problem, which it is, but it's often funded or committed by people that are connected to organized crime or other types of illicit trade activity, making it very hard to quantify. So the numbers that we have, as you rightly quoted, are from organizations such as the OECD, which is the Organization on Economic Cooperation and Development, or from customs agencies throughout the world who will report out on the amount of seized counterfeit goods coming into their borders, which, as you may know, is the number itself is accurate, but it's not an accurate reflection of how much counterfeit product is actually coming in. So we look at something like US Customs and Border Protection data, And we know that they only look at 1 to 2% of incoming product into the United States because that's all they can do in order to keep the flow of goods coming into the country. Otherwise, it would totally stop the supply chains if they had to inspect everything. And we know the statistics they have from that. We also know statistics from companies who've done their own seizures of goods, as well as a lot of online companies that do web scraping to see what's out there. That's not necessarily an accurate reflection of how many goods there are, but it shows how many counterfeit postings for sales there are. And then there's a lot of other organizations, especially around the UN or the EU, that tend to study this as well. But it's very difficult to quantify. What we do know from the center is anyone that has any type of product that has a trademark on it, that is a successful product, and there is demand for it in the marketplace, whether that's consumer facing or whether that's business to business, is going to be counterfeited in some way. Counterfeiters target those who have successful products. They're not going to ever target someone who does not have a successful product, because what they do is they rely on the goodwill of that company and the reputation of that company to create a product that some consumer or buyer wants. So they're only going to go after those successful companies. Where do we see it happening was the other part of your question. Current statistics, at least out of the US government right now, note that majority of it comes from China, at least as what we receive in the US. So we will see globally that those patterns look differently depending on where you are, whether you're in Latin America, whether you're in Africa, Middle East, Asia, different parts of Asia, Western, Eastern Europe, and so on. But right now in the US, most of the counterfeit product does come from manufacturing in China. That being said, too, it's really complex. So each country, if we look at them, can either be a country of origin, so a country where counterfeit goods are manufactured, a transit country where they're moved through, or a destination country, so where they are sold to. A lot of countries will see multiple multiple labels. For example, China is both an origin and a destination country. You look at somewhere like the Emirates, they tend to be more of a transit country, although they do have some that originate from there and some that are sold there. The United States is primarily a destination country, but we're also transit and country of origin as well. Although our destination, we tend to have a lot of consumer consumption here, so we end up with a lot of counterfeit goods.
Yeah, so I'm going to break that down a little bit. So we know that manufacturing is migrating from China. There are an awful lot of companies that are leaving China now and going to another low-cost country such as Vietnam or Indonesia, Thailand, places like that, and Mexico. And it's my understanding that the counterfeiters are moving right along with them. So
Correct.
it isn't that, we're going to solve the problem of having counterfeiters in China. It's that China was the opportunity country, and now that's moved to many other countries. Is that what you're finding as well?
Yep, you're exactly right. And we've been seeing that pattern happen for some time. And I think we're going to continue to see that shift depending on, which countries start being the lower cost manufacturing countries. A couple of my colleagues and I, a couple of years ago, we think that, Africa might be one of those next destinations where that starts happening, as the cost of human labor is much less, unfortunately. And we tend to see counterfeit manufacturing often be associated with some type of international labor violation as well, poor working conditions, sometimes bordering on inhumane or slave-like conditions. There's several agencies that have put out different reports around that. So we will see that continue to shift over time as countries evolve and their economies evolve and their manufacturing evolves as well.
So industrial buyers, for example, that might be considering an alternate country to China because of a counterfeiting situation, are likely to face counterfeiting in any country they're sourcing. So we got to watch out for that.
Correct.
The other thing, yeah. So the other thing I wanted to also talk about when you mentioned this, that there are nefarious people in all kinds of criminal activities, gun trafficking or arms trafficking, human trafficking, drug cartels, all that kind of thing, that are using counterfeits to raise funds or as a way to launder money. But there are also a bunch of teenagers out there that are buying counterfeit goods and reselling them on Amazon, for example, or eBay or different places. I'm guilty of buying products that I knew were not genuine, like, for example, a charger for my laptop. I'm always looking for a lightweight charger that I can travel with, and it's a little easier to use and travel with. And I know I'm buying a non-branded part that may be branded, HP or Dell or something like that, even though it's not real. So, part of the guilt comes on the consumer as well. I mean, the consumer's got to take responsibility for making sure they're buying real parts, right?
Yeah, and it's complicated, right? So there's deceptive and non-deceptive counterfeits. So deceptive means you don't really know you're buying counterfeit. And I would say with the explosion of online sales, it's harder and harder to tell as a consumer whether you're buying counterfeit or not. I mean, I work in this field and have for 7 years. Last year, I probably bought 7 or 8 products online that when I didn't realize they were counterfeits, they got to my house. The posting looked legitimate. I looked for all of the signs that we know will sort of differentiate between a fake and a real product. And I still got them and they were still counterfeit. And I said, okay, I work in this field. What about the average consumer? Most people don't go about saying, I'm looking to buy counterfeit, although there are entire segments of our society that are obsessed, for example, with dupes. So we see that in the luxury brand space, that people know they're buying fake product. We see social media influencers talking about, unboxing a dupe and how good is it compared to the original. So we do see that, but then we see a lot of unwitting consumers buy the deceptive counterfeits, where it's very hard, where if you hold up, 2 products next to each other, it is almost impossible to tell unless you are the actual brand who's manufactured it. And sometimes they even have to go back to their engineering department or do testing on it to determine whether it's real or not. Sometimes it's very difficult to tell.
I've been to the museum in Washington, D.C., and where they have all the counterfeits next to the real products. It's impossible to tell the difference. Just no
Yeah.
way. And there's just no way you can tell. And so that scary thought, in an industrial buying situation in supply chain people, in industrial buying and in purchasing departments, the buyers are often rewarded for how much money they can save, right? So sometimes they get bonuses if they save the company a lot of money, and that's one of their main ways they're evaluated is on savings. So obviously they're going to look for anything that might be slightly cheaper and to be able to recognize those savings for the company. So that is, I think, a misalignment of goals, because they're likely to be buying counterfeits unknowingly in order to achieve their own personal goals of saving for the company, or that's the way they're evaluated. And I think that's a huge problem that we need to deal with in supply chains, to make sure that people aren't just buying whatever's cheapest in order to achieve those goals. So it's kind of a mismatch. It's the wrong goal. And in an industrial situation, they might be buying electronics, or a lot of electronics, I guess, or all kinds of industrial products that go into production. So I always think about that when I get on an airplane and I buckle my seatbelt and we're ready to take off. And because of the work that I've done in counterfeiting, I always think, oh man, I hope there's no counterfeits in the avionics on this airplane.
You and me both.
Yeah, and it may be no way to tell. I mean, the airliners or the airlines may think they have legitimate products, and they just don't know. So are most of the counterfeiters, though, operating in online sales? So it isn't just consumers who are buying things, but industrial buyers also have sections on Amazon, for example, where they can buy industrial goods now. eBay is a place where a lot of counterfeits are, is my understanding. So is online the biggest problem for counterfeiters, or
So
for
that's a
counterfeit?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So traditionally it wasn't, and we've seen that evolution occur over the last 10 years, but predominantly over the last 2.5 years because of the onset of the pandemic, and everybody forced to work online in one way or another. I mean, there's obviously still a lot of people that are coming back into the face-to-face, but we've seen that move in that direction. It's been great, right? I mean, I've been able to work from home. I can buy everything I need from my house to be shipped directly to my house as a consumer. But we also see that happen more and more on the industrial side as well. So it's sort of the same, the same sort of look back in the brick and mortar of know your suppliers. That still holds true even to the online space. So if you're buying something, like you said, and you are only looking at cost, whether you are a buyer or whether you're a consumer, that is going to be a big problem for you. And the counterfeiters know that. They price accordingly, and sometimes it's very subtle. So it used to be very glaringly obvious where the real product may be, $100 a case, and then the counterfeit product would be like $15 a case. So everyone's like, oh, that good is, that's too good to be true, and it was. But now they're more savvy, so now they may put it at $90 a case, so it looks like it's a legitimate discount when in fact it isn't. So they've gotten better at that, and they always seem to be not one step ahead, but they move very quickly in what the patterns look like. So if someone's looking at patterns of counterfeiting 2 or 3 years ago and trying to apply business strategy to that now, it probably won't be very effective because of how rapidly they switch, and they switch gear and they change pace because they have no regulations to follow. They are essentially illicit entrepreneurs in that sense. So if they can make money off of it and they can get into either some type of legitimate supply chain in some way or another, and sometimes that happens through a combination, as you were mentioning, of what we call converging crimes with counterfeiting. So sometimes it's on the very scary side, which is terrorism, drug trade, human trafficking, but sometimes it's combined with white collar crime too, with employee theft, with, other things where maybe someone will take out a couple pallets of legitimate and put in the counterfeit product and then go sell the legitimate on the black market. There's a lot of different ways that we see that happen.
Wow, it's pretty scary in terms of they're everywhere. They're all around us. I saw a statistic that said 1 in 5 products that you buy on Amazon or eBay is likely to be counterfeit. 1 in 5. And just, like you said, I do the same thing. I buy all kinds of stuff online. It comes to my house. It's convenient. It just seems like the best thing to do at this time and place. And yet I'm likely buying counterfeit products and don't know it.
Yeah.
Wow, it's really, really scary, especially in, important situations where it's a life and death issue, like electronics, for example, and automobiles and airplanes, as well as cosmetics. I think cosmetics are really high on the list of counterfeits. Anything that you're putting on your skin or ingesting, nutraceuticals, that sort of thing. These are all subject to counterfeiters, and it could be quite harmful. In fact, I've read some horror stories about people who ingested counterfeit pharmaceuticals, and were given them by a legitimate doctor, or prescription was written, and just didn't know that there were counterfeits in that supply chain. These are scary times for sure, for sure. Okay, so what kind of things, and I know from my research also that there's some technologies out there that can be added to products to make sure that they're legitimate. There's software, there's all kinds of things. So can you talk a little bit about what kind of things we can do or take advantage of in order to prevent purchasing counterfeit products?
Sure. So great question. So from the business side, the A-CAPP Center has always advocated for a very holistic approach to fighting counterfeiting, meaning not just one tool will work, or there's one magic technology that you can slap on a product that will prevent counterfeiting, but we really believe there has to be a proactive and a reactive approach. So the reactive approach is what we often hear about in the media, which is someone has discovered counterfeit, whether it's online, whether it's in their legitimate supply chain, and then they go and try to fix that problem. That will always exist no matter what. And that is what companies will do spend a lot of time doing, especially because, when one of these incidents happen, they have to be responsive, especially if it's in the media or it's leaked in some way. They have to show that they're taking proper steps, and most companies want to do that anyways. But then on the proactive side, a lot of things have to happen in order to be really successful with this. And we've seen, a lot of companies that we work with personally. We work with about over 500 different companies, everyone from multinational enterprises to smaller local businesses. The steps that they take using the resources they have to really be proactive. Some of that can be, training different units throughout the enterprise on what is counterfeiting and how they can really take steps to help prevent it. So as you mentioned, the buyers, a lot of times negotiating these supplier contracts or audits or whatever that may look like of manufacturing facilities for the product or the packaging, and really being proactive about sort of what those warning signs are and how to be able to see that throughout the supply chain.
Can you talk about that a little bit? You mentioned earlier that you evaluated a product online before you bought it, and you were looking for certain things. What are those certain things that we can look for, when we're deciding whether to buy something or not? Make sure it's legitimate.
Sure. So there's two different, I think, like paths for that, right? One is if you're buying company to company, business to business. The other is if you're a consumer buying online. So if you're a consumer buying online, I would advocate, especially if you're buying from an e-commerce site, that you are buying only from the manufacturer of the good. So if I am buying, I have in front of me some Clear Eyes eye drops. I'm only buying them from the manufacturer. I'm not buying them from like discount eye drops or, eye drops or us or whatever that may be, that I'm buying them only from the manufacturer. So that is probably one of the best and most solid ways to be able to do that. However, sometimes that's difficult to determine still. And one of those things you have to do is, especially on some sites, which hopefully with new congressional legislation up, this will be changing soon. It's very difficult to find the manufacturer. You have to scroll all the way down on the page and try to see who it is actually sold by, because sometimes they'll name the stores with the legitimate brand name, even though it's not the brand that's selling it. And then you look below and it's coming from China or from Vietnam or from wherever that is. So actually look through who is selling that. That takes time. If we're used to one click and it gets delivered tomorrow, that whole transaction can take less than 30 seconds to look for a product, buy it, ship it, it'll come prime the next day. But to actually look through who is selling it and where they are shipping it from. That's a good step. It's not necessarily foolproof. But to look at pricing too, we've seen a lot of scenarios, like I mentioned earlier, where the counterfeiter will come in on like a listing 1 or 2 cents cheaper than the legitimate brand. And they do that because if you rank via price, they will show up first every time. And people often go for the legitimate one. But also to understand too that shipping, for example, if someone is selling with Prime and you get it a day or two later, that's not a guarantee as well that the product isn't counterfeit. It's not going through Amazon's facilities, so it's coming straight from the seller. And if you don't know the seller, who knows what they're sending you? So
yeah, my understanding that Amazon is pushing really hard to get their sellers to ship direct instead of through the Amazon centers. So a lot of the suppliers have been moved to their own platforms. It used to be they deliver, say, a pallet load of goods to an Amazon warehouse, and then as sales were made, they decrement that inventory and then replenish it. But Amazon has pushed those suppliers back to their own facilities. So they'll get an order and then the supplier ships direct. And that's a little scary too. It reduces at least some oversight or some kind of organization that might be like Amazon, for example. I know they have a very active anti-counterfeiting group. So there's at least some oversight there. But when you're shipping from a distributor or someone that you don't know and can't verify, that creates another problem or an opportunity for counterfeiters. Yeah.
definitely. And I'm not aware of that shift on Amazon's part, but I actually don't know if that, I think that's probably an okay idea, as opposed to all of that going through the warehouse, because I think when it goes through the warehouse, it does lend legitimacy, right? Like you mentioned, that it's gone through some type of process, whether it has or not. And there was these 2 or 3 pieces of pending legislation from earlier this year that were introduced into both the House and the Senate about a year ago. They were bipartisan, bicameral pieces of legislation, the Informed Consumers Act and the Shop Safe Act. And part of those were putting in place proactive measures for e-commerce platforms to vet both the sellers and their products in advance to the best they can to try to weed out some of these counterfeiters. Some platforms are doing that already. Some have started doing it since the legislation was proposed, but it's yet to be seen, where that's going to fall and what that's going to look like.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the technologies too? So it's
Sure.
my understanding that some companies actually put chips in their products, and ways of validating things, and there's software available also. So can you
Sure.
talk a little bit about those kind of solutions?
Yeah, and that goes back to what I was mentioning about the proactive approaches, right? So using technology is often a proactive approach for brands. And what they can do, there's a variety of different types of technology and that are out there, which are ever evolving, also to try to keep up with the counterfeiters, everything from covert, semi-covert marks, holograms, barcodes, RFID tags, blockchain, artificial intelligence and machine learning. All of these are being used right now for anti-counterfeiting, as well as many other things. So anything from like a track and trace type of technology, which is used primarily in the legitimate supply chain to take a product or a product in a package or in a pallet or whatever that may be, and to trace it from the point of leaving the manufacturing facility until wherever its end location is, whether that's in a store for a consumer or whether that's in a plant to manufacture some other type of part. But that technology enables one to sort of follow what that looks like. How that is used can make a difference too. Whether the technology is just on a pallet, sometimes we've seen that happen, and then counterfeiters empty the pallet and put fake product in the pallet. Whether that is on the individual package, whether it's actually embedded in the product itself. And of course, this varies depending on what the product is. I mean, we think of everything from like automobile replacement parts to, as you mentioned, airline, to food ingredients, to makeup ingredients. I mean, this can vary widely, and it is also the complexity of it varies depending on what it is and how easy it is to put a technology into things. But I've heard like something just came out, a new technology came out maybe a month ago around food counterfeiting, and that is some type of additive or technology where you can tell if the liquid inside of a bottle is fake or real, like if it's actually the product or not, without having to open the bottle. And I was like, that's incredible, but that's something that's necessary because you can have a legitimate real package, of, let's say, some type of, flavored water, and you have no idea what's actually in the package. Without opening it and testing every single bottle, which, as you can imagine, sort of defeats the whole purpose. So technology has to be used in a way that is still cost effective for the company. It does its job, but then doesn't raise the price of the product so much that the consumers will stop buying it, or whoever the end, the end user is will stop buying it. It can't be cost prohibitive. So there's this cost benefit analysis of it, right? You can't just throw all the biggest technologies in the world on a Band-Aid, for example, or a pencil or something, that has a lower risk. But for some of these products you mentioned earlier, anything you put on and in your body or your pet's body, or that is a health and safety issue, any type of electronic that could catch on fire or explode or something around that, it's definitely worth thinking about from a corporate perspective.
And coming out of the pandemic, of course, we saw, counterfeiting being a huge problem in PPE production in China, to the extent that even the Chinese customs were stopping shipments going out of China. And those are, that's a situation where we were desperate for this kind of equipment and, consumables, medical consumables, and that sort of thing. And so it gave rise to all sorts of counterfeiters and illegitimate manufacturing sites all over the world to try to address that demand, and people that were, making a huge amount of money on selling these kind of goods around the world, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. So yeah, boy, big issue. So we're hoping that more technology becomes or is introduced into supply chains in order to control these illegitimate products from moving further or being stopped along the supply chain somewhere where it's determined that they're not legitimate goods. So that's, hopeful, at least in the future. And I know, as you were saying, I know you've testified in front of Congress, both the Senate and the House. And I'm a member of the National Association of Manufacturers, and I'm on the anti-counterfeiting committee there. So there's work being done, but it's slow, and I think it's also up to industrial buyers, people in supply chain to be aware of what they're doing, to ask questions, to try to legitimize who they're buying from, and what might be a component product in those individual parts and products. Well, it's been fascinating, Kari. Really, really appreciate it. Do you have any closing thoughts?
No, just that, this is something that, every department or every profession that works in industry has to really sort of pay attention to and work across what might normally be traditional silos within a company. So even if you're in supply chain, this is an area sometimes where you might have to bring in legal or, security or something like that. We see the most effective approaches to this are ones that are truly multi-division, multidisciplinary, where the company is working together to deal with this, because it isn't just a supply chain issue or just a security issue or just a legal issue. It's something that really can affect an entire company. And as always, we're an academic center. We're always willing to talk to people or help them or provide our resources. They're free to anyone, and they're available on our website.
So with that in mind, can you give us a contact information for the A-CAPP Center and your contact information?
Sure. The A-CAPP Center's website is a-capp.msu.edu. And my email is kkammel@msu.edu. Also available on our website.
Thank you so much. And you can listen to more Frictionless Supply Chain podcasts posted on Supply Chain Management Review's landing page, iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can reach me, Rosemary Coates, at rcoates, RCOATES, at reshoringinstitute.org, where we publish all of our research on manufacturing in America. Thank you, everyone, for listening today. Have a great day.